Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast spotlighting stories of personal transformation and underrepresented leaders in mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raj Siraj. If you're learning from or enjoying Minority Trip Report, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Today, my guest is Ifetayo Harvey, who founded the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. The People of Color Psychedelic Collective educates and builds community with people of color interested in psychedelics and ending the war on drugs. In 2022, Open Society Foundation named Ifetayo a 2022 Soros Justice Fellow. Thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Ra. Thank you for having me.
We shared the stage in New York at Athenaeum a couple of months ago, which was fantastic. My sister's already a big fan. She heard of your story. She heard you present, and she's asked me about you. I want to start right away by opening up the conversation about psychedelics in the Black community. There seems to be the prominence of cannabis that's more popular in, let's say, Black media or in music and culture. But I come at this question from not just necessarily about the experience of Black communities, but people in color in general. Being in tech, I often hear about CEOs and high-powered individuals taking acid and going on these retreats and peak performance and this stuff. But when it comes to minorities and smoking weed and things like that, it seems to be shunned and criminalized so openly. Whereas anybody who tends to be a CEO or whatever can talk about taking acid in a forest. So to me, there's such a disparity in the way our culture considers who is allowed to escape their bodies, who is allowed to explore their consciousness versus not. So let's start there. Let me throw this to you. Why is there a difference in the way psychedelics is experienced or consumed or portrayed in the Black community versus cannabis?
I think that cannabis has been present in the U.S. longer than psychedelics. And when I say present, it has been more widespread, more popularized for a longer period. If you look at a lot of the early drug policy laws in the U.S., going to the late 1800s, early 1900s, cannabis started to become associated with Mexican migrant things like psilocybin mushrooms. LSD become popularized so much later, maybe the 50s and 60s. I think that has something to do with it. Cannabis is also, because it's been around longer in the U.S., it's more readily available to buy on the street. It's a lot harder to find psychedelics. That said, I think that Black people have been using psychedelics in different forms for a long time. Obviously, we know about Iboga in Gabon that's associated with the Bwiti people. And I know that there are probably so many other forms of what you call traditional medicine, plant medicine throughout the African continent. When we look at contemporary uses of psychedelics, going back to the 60s and 70s, there are a lot of Black artists who use psychedelics as a way to make art, music, or to influence their work. I think you can look at people like George Clinton, Lucy Collins, even
Hendrix.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Jimi Hendrix, of course. Yeah, but even some of the R&B groups like the Commodores or the Temptations, Four Tops, I think they also incorporated some elements of psychedelic rock into their music. So I think that Black people in the U.S. are forced to be quieter about our drug use because we know that the man is watching, and surveillance has been a reality for a lot of us, for me, but also going back to the civil rights movement. There are paid informants. And I guess in Black consciousness, we're always aware that the man is watching in one way or the other. When it comes to talking about drug use, we learn to talk in codes and learn not to talk on the phone about it. Definitely not talk to the media about it. So I think that's why you don't hear as much from Black folks about psychedelics. But now we hear lots of rappers, singers talk about their psychedelic use. I forget what rapper, I'm forgetting his name, but I know there was like an acid rap album. Future song a few years ago, Molly Percocet, was extremely popular. And some people may not consider Molly a psychedelic, but there are some camps of folks who do. So I think that it's not necessarily about us using it less. I think there is evidence for that, but I think it's about how it looks different. And I also think that Black folks tend to use substances less than our white counterparts. That's my theory. That's not proven. But in 2013, released a report on cannabis arrests around possession, and it looked at every single state. And across the U.S., Black people were up to 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis use or possession, even though the rates that we use cannabis are similar to white folks, if not less. So I think that reality comes into play in terms of like how we talk about psychedelics. And psychedelics have also been associated with white folks for a long time, like the hippie movement. And so for those of us who never tried psychedelics, there's that hesitancy because we're like, oh, this is some white people shit. I'm not fucking with that. Because in the Black community, a lot of times we see like white people shit as living on the edge unnecessarily. And being Black will already have you living on the edge in the US just because our skin color is just a signal for so many racist places.
I think it's such an important point to keep in mind. And I was going to ask you, maybe there is something also there about the experience of the substance itself that makes it less appropriate. For example, can I imagine just anyone being able to drop some acid and dance in a weird way in a park?
No,
Why
someone
not?
call the cops on it.
If you're crawling on all fours saying, hey, is this real? And then, yeah, who has the luxury of doing that? And who gets to be experienced as a hostile person in that environment? So I think there's something definitely about the sort of head spaces, the mind spaces that you tend to go to on these substances, the way that you're treated when you are acting a particular way, not even being hostile, but the way you're allowed to express yourself, right? And the politics of that is really interesting to me. So I appreciate you talking about.
Yeah, I was going to say that we as a people have had in our history all forms of autonomy stripped away from us, right? And these substances hit towards having that loss of control again in some way. And so I think that for us, that is scary because we've had to fight to get that autonomy back. So dipping into psychedelics can be scary because it's okay, that loss of control. And then, the idea of being in the public eye with it, that's also just so many layers to it, right? So
With that said, I also think that the kind of music that tends to come out, generalizing broadly, I'm by no way or means a R&B or a hip hop enthusiast. I know a few songs here and there, but when I first heard A$AP's LSD, I was like, wow, this is a very different A$AP Rocky. In the 50s and 60s, you shared with me before on a call about your mother's experience growing up in that time in the civil rights movement. Tell me a little bit about her experience as you've heard from her growing up in that time, experimenting with psychedelics, and then her attitude had changed, but for different reasons. Tell me a little bit about her experience growing up at that time as you know it now.
Yeah, so my mom is from a really small town in Georgia, probably like 2,000 people. And when she was growing up, she was born December 1st, 1955, the same day that Rosa Parks got arrested on the bus in Birmingham. But my mom grew up with racism, very blatant racism. She was shot with a BB gun by a white man when she was 10 years old. Started working as a domestic when she was 13 for some of the white folks in her town. So that shaped her perspective in terms of politics. And then along with that, my mom was going to segregated schools up until the 70s. And it was when she started going to school with white kids that she got introduced to cannabis. And she liked it. And by the time she was in her 20s, she moved down to Orlando, Florida, and started getting out of that small town mindset. Was meeting a lot of folks who were immigrants from the Caribbean, Latin America. And she would tell me a lot of times on her break at work, she would be smoking a joint with her friends. That's when it started to shift in American culture. And she told me about one of the times that she took acid. She went on a bike ride to a park, and there was a water fountain. It was like oozing out all these colors. And I know that her friends at the time experimented with like mescaline, acid. And she went to Pink Floyd show, saw the laser lights, and loved Pink Floyd. And she also told me then that's when she started seeing people use heroin too. And it wasn't something that she tried, but she witnessed some folks using heroin around her age. And as a kid, she would play Pink Floyd really loud in the house. My family had their own stereo system, and we always played music super loud. And Pink Floyd music used to scare me as a kid because it was so out there. But then as I got older, I had an interest in history, and I would always ask my mom questions about her upbringing. And my mom grew very poor, and again, saw a lot of blatant racism. And as I became a teenager, she started telling me about how the cops had taken one of her uncles and beat him up for no reason and put him in jail. Mm-hmm. And when I was in 8th grade, I had this project to do the history of music of the 60s and 70s. So that's when I started like thinking about psychedelics, but as a 14-year-old, you don't really have a grasp on it unless you take it. And I wasn't interested in taking it, but I was really fascinated by that particular part of history. And so as I got older, I love all the music, the British Invasion, the Motown, Stax Records, but I always had kind of this cloud hanging over me as a kid because my dad went to prison and he was deported. And there were also other things going on that I didn't know how to talk about. My family kept that away from me a lot of times because they didn't want to involve me in that kind of thing. And so as I got older, my mom shared with me that she smoked weed. And I didn't know that my whole life. I didn't know my mom smoked weed. But she started smoking in front of me when I was like 17.
Sparked that. If she was if this was being hidden or it was taboo in your family, how did it just come up?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think she realized that I was of the age now where she could see it, where I could see it and be okay.
Was it like a cautionary tale or more, if you want to smoke it, just be safe, smoke it, do what you want?
Yeah, she did say that. She did say that. My mom got arrested for possession with intent to sell in a small town in South Carolina. And 2 of my siblings were in the car. So she temporarily lost custody of my siblings and ended up going to court. She didn't do any prison time, but she was prosecuted by one of the Murdaughs. And if you don't know who the Murdaughs are, they were a powerful family in Hampton County, South Carolina. Netflix and HBO did a special on them recently because they're very corrupt, even though they had a huge hand in running that county for many generations. But I think she was also cautious of that, like bringing her smoking in front of. But once I got to college, she was like watching Netflix documentaries on the whole meth craze, and I don't care if you smoke reefer, but don't do any meth. So yeah, I don't know what sparked that change in her, but I think it was just her being tired of hiding it all those years and her figuring that we're old enough, it's okay. Yeah.
I'm obviously going to ask you later in the podcast about what she thinks about your work now, given that you're very substances and decriminalization and so on. I want to go to your father's story because I think that's when you first spoke about him, or when I first heard about it, it felt like a very challenging, difficult thing to go through, but a very healing process as well, given that you've reconciled. Can you tell us a little bit about what had happened to your father?
Yes. So my dad immigrated to the U.S. from Jamaica in his younger days, and he was a migrant worker who got introduced to drug selling through his migrant work. And he was involved in selling drugs for some years. As a kid, I didn't know any of this stuff because, again, my parents kept that away from me. He was just my dad, and I needed him as a mechanic. But my dad had been on the run for over a decade,
Mm.
and he was, evading arrest. And eventually, his right hand man snitched on him, and they found my dad and arrested him. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for cocaine trafficking. He was incarcerated in Florida. I grew up in South Carolina, so I didn't see my dad while he was incarcerated. He served about half of his sentence, about 8 years, and was deported immediately after. I grew up with my dad up until the age of 4 or 5, and then he went to prison, got out, and then reconciled with him when I was 16 in person. Throughout his time in prison, we wrote letters to each other. And when he got out, that's when we started talking on the phone. And when I was
He
a
was in the U.S.
teenager,
for a bit when he got out, or you said he was deported to Jamaica right after?
he was deported right after.
Mm.
Yeah. 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 When I was a teenager, I had a part-time job and I saved money to get a passport and to buy a ticket to Jamaica because I wanted to meet him again and rebuild our relationship. And my dad had a hard life growing up. He was pretty much abandoned by his parents. In Jamaica, it's very common for people to go to places like England, Canada, the US to go work and meet their kids with another family member. And so that's basically what happened to him. And in some ways, that set him up for the life that he had in the US. But it was really about him trying to make money for himself and his family in Jamaica because Jamaica is a very poor country and selling drugs was a profitable industry. It still is. Everyone uses drugs. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't recognize when their livelihood that's at stake. Drug dealing isn't just about getting rich; it's about actually supporting a community of people where there's no work, not enough opportunity to do other things. That's the only work you get.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
People want the sort of local gangster or the crime lead there because they will bring opportunity to the community and some money will
Mhm.
flow in for right or wrong. It's still what it is. People still want livelihoods, right? And we feel
Mhm.
abandoned by our
Mhm.
government. It only escalates that. What was it like
Yep.
meeting your dad in Jamaica for the first time?
It was it was awkward in a lot of ways because here's this man who we look a lot alike. We have similar characteristics, but I haven't seen him in so long. In some ways, it felt like finding the missing piece of the puzzle that you've been working on for many years. And ultimately, it's a journey still, even though he's been out for almost 20 years now. We missed out on a lot of things, like a lot of time together, all of those benchmark parts of your life, like graduation, puberty, all those things. So, if in some ways it was overwhelming because I was seeing him for the first time in years, but also being in Jamaica too was like my first time traveling as a semi-adult. And so taking all of the surroundings in and the culture, and it was funny because I went to Jamaica thinking that I would be able to understand patois. And boy, was I fooled. My dad, he was really excited. He introduced me to a lot of our family members there, a lot of his friends, and we would be sitting in someone's house and they be in a conversation. And after a while, I just like, my eyes would glaze over. And he's, "Are you okay?" And I'm just like, I had no idea what y'all are talking about. So yeah, it's been a journey just catching up on that side of myself. And he was very protective of me, he loves cooking for me, that kind of thing, and just catching up, making up for lost time. Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to also touch on your last point as well about when people get so desperate, they turn to certain avenues for money. And I think that's so true. Even in Jamaica, being a contract killer is its own job. Like you can pay someone $1,000 to go kill someone for you. And it's unfortunate, it's messed up, but that's become the way of life there. So I think it's easy for folks to, look at a drug seller and judge their life, but also not understand what it's like to be in their shoes and understand that, there's a supply and demand here. And someone has to do it, whether you like it or not. But oftentimes, drug dealers they're harm reductionists, they're community members, philanthropists even. So I think that we have to challenge this notion of what a drug dealer looks like.
Absolutely. And there's always a pyramid. Yes, the money is being made at the bottom of the
Mm-hmm.
pyramid, but the money also flows up. So who is the one making the money?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get replaced, right? The head is
Mm-hmm.
usually somebody in government or high up. Somebody who is funneling or guiding the systems to turn a blind eye. And when somebody falls out of favor, that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
I'm speaking for Bangladesh, and again, it's organized crime. But yeah, I do agree with you. I think we have to challenge all the aspects of society that we deem to be bad or poor, to be corrupt, and so on. Corruption, in some ways, leads to employment, leads to opportunity. The gap the state or private sector is not going to fill or is not filling. It's
Mm-hmm.
some possible way for people to come up of their dire situation. I totally agree with you. It's very easy to just turn a blind eye or criticize or judge people. Same with homelessness, I find. When you see somebody out on the street asking for money and the person's like being snotty and goes, "Oh, if I give you money, you'll only use it for drugs." I'm like, "That's what I'm gonna use it for." What's why are you judging this?
Yeah,
What's the problem here?
exactly. Exactly. It all boils down to us not liking or approving of certain people's drug use over
Yeah.
others. Yeah.
Speaking of which, so for up till the age of 17, you weren't aware of your parents or your mom's drug use in the past. Sounds like you weren't
Mhm.
really doing anything at that time. Walk me through a little bit about your journey with substances yourself.
Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying that I was, as a kid, very nerdy and super obedient, goody two shoes. I was a little sneaky too, but and so because of that, and because of my dad being incarcerated for selling drugs, I always thought that, oh, if I stay away from that stuff, then I'll be successful. I won't get into any trouble. When I got to high school, I got introduced to alcohol. My high school had somewhat of a drinking culture. And yeah, I remember my first time getting drunk when I was 15, taking 3 shots of vodka. But alcohol wasn't like a big thing for me in high school. I tried it like here and there, but not often. And then my senior year of high school, one of my friends, we were just hanging out. She introduced me to weed. And I was like, okay. Like, she's teaching me how to smoke a bowl. And I'm like, okay. But I didn't know what to expect, but I had a great time. I ended up just geeking out the whole time, laughing like crazy. I couldn't stop laughing the whole night. We even had another friend come over, and he was someone who was like, he just liked talking about himself. And I was just like holding back laughter the entire time. So I had a really good experience with weed. And then when I got to college, I went from South Carolina to Massachusetts for college, and that was a huge culture shock for me. Just being in a cold state where it like snowed 4 feet off the ground, and being around rich kids who went to private school or boarding school and whose parents could afford to shell out $60,000 a year for college is a huge culture shock. And I started using weed to cope with that, to cope with anxiety, to cope with doing my schoolwork. And it actually helped me. Yeah, I remember drafting one of my papers for one of my history classes. I was like stoned out of my mind, and I drafted the paper high and then went back sober and wrote the actual paper, but I got the highest grade in the class. And so I don't think it was the weed putting the knowledge in my head, but I think the weed was stoling that anxiety that got in the way of me doing my homework. And then, so yeah, I became a stoner in college, and I had some friends who I would smoke every night with, and that was a routine. Smoke a bowl, shit talk, gossip, that kind of thing, then go to bed. And then, let's see, junior year, that's when some of my friends started. No, I would say earlier than that. I started hearing about Molly, people partying with it, and I had no interest in it. But my senior year of college, I got diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and I was really depressed my senior year. I had overcommitted myself with my extracurriculars and was just doing so much on campus. And then the depression hit, and I'm like, oh crap, what am I going to do? And so I was already in therapy at that point. I started seeing the psychiatrist, and she told me that, hey, we can prescribe you Wellbutrin or Celexa. And I was scared of that. I have some friends who use antidepressants and they work really well for them. So no judgment to people who do use them, but I was scared of it because I never used anything like that before. And my mom is what I call a folk herbalist. And so she was always very skeptical of pharmaceutical drugs. And so I had this decision to make. Do I want to try this SSRI, or there's pretty much no alternatives here except like exercising, changing my diet, but that's a totally different thing. And so I was stuck. I didn't know what to do. But in October 2013, the Drug Policy Alliance invited me to their conference in Denver, Colorado. And I was going to speak about my experience of growing up with my dad in prison and how the war on drugs affected my family. And I did not know what I was getting myself into. I was 21, speaking in front of an audience of 1,100 people. I ended up breaking down and crying during my speech. But it was a very cathartic moment for me. And then after that was all over, I go into different panels. I come across this panel on end-of-life treatment and psychedelics. So it was talking about people with cancer using LSD. And I'm sitting in the back of this room. I'm like, oh, this kind of makes sense. I don't know why, but it just did. And I've always had a philosophical interest in death. And again, I never used psychedelics, but something in my head clicked. And I told myself, I'm going to try mushrooms. And after the conference was over, I go back to school in Massachusetts. I'm asking my friends, like, how do I do mushrooms? And they tell me, like, take 3.5 grams. It's going to taste nasty, but eat it with some peanut butter, like a peanut butter sandwich or something. Go out in the woods. Make sure you have a sitter with you, someone you trust. So I was like, okay, again, the nerdy side of me, I'm like taking all the notes and making sure everything's good. I ended up getting some mushrooms from the person that I got weed from. And one Saturday, I ate the mushrooms. My friend Allison, who's a psychology major, she's a therapist now. She was my sitter. So we went out into the woods. We had this really beautiful nature trail at my college. And I just went in thinking that like I was desperate. I wanted to heal. I wanted to feel better because I was struggling with suicidal ideation. I was thinking about dying all the time, passively. And so I wanted to feel something different. And so we're on this beautiful nature trail, and I'm like just waiting for it to kick in. And then I start seeing subtle signs that it's starting. Like I was looking at the water and it's like glistening more than usual. I'm looking at the plants and the trees and they're like breathing. And I'm like, oh man, I'm feeling something. And the nausea started to hit me too. And I didn't know about that. I was like, oh man, I feel like I got too drunk or something. I'm about to vomit. And I ended up vomiting. But after that, the journey was actually really healing for me in the sense that I felt joy like I hadn't felt joy in a really long time. And I laughed so deeply that I was reminded of what it feels to laugh with joy. But I also cried too. I would go from crying to laughing. But it reminded me of why life is beautiful, why life is also difficult and painful sometimes too. But the mushrooms showed me the beauty of life, just seeing the plants breathe. And for most of my life, I aligned myself with being an atheist or agnostic. And that journey showed me that, maybe there is more out there than, what you've seen. And so that totally, shifted my perspective. And by the end of my senior year, like literally a few days before graduation, I got me and 5 of my friends to trip together too. And it was a great experience. Yeah. So that was the beginning of my experience. And I've gone on to journey with other substances as well. And I like to just be educated about what I'm using so I know how to take care of myself. But mushrooms were my first. I would say I also consider cannabis a psychedelic as well. I've had a lot of psychedelic experiences with cannabis. So those are like my first two loves. Yeah.
What is it like now telling your mom if you have told her about your psychedelic experience? How does she process it?
Oh
Have you
man.
spoken to her about it?
Yeah, yeah. So funny. I think about a year after I graduated college, I was still trying to find my place in the world job wise. And so I had moved back in with my mom, and two of my brothers were there as well. And I ended up, I think I got them to take mushrooms once. Like we took mushrooms together, but not like in a super, it was just informal. And my brothers are scared. My mom is a little scared too. Oh, I'm in my 60s now. I can't be taking these things like I used to be. And so it was like a small dose we took together, but it was pretty cool. And so since that was probably 2015, but a lot has changed since 2015. Some of my other siblings have gotten into psychedelics. One of my sisters, she started learning how to grow mushrooms. One of my brothers started learning how to grow mushrooms. So they're much more enthusiastic about it now. My sister gave my mom these mushroom chocolates, like microdoses. And so she takes them here and there, and I'll ask her, I'm like, how is it? And she's like, oh, it's great. It gives me energy. I get to do all the stuff that I need to do. So my mom likes it. She doesn't take like a big dose, but she's open to it. I told her about my experience with Wachuma, also known as San Pedro, and she said that she would be up to try it. So she's been really supportive. I think she just wants me to be safe and don't do anything dumb. But I think she's up for it, for herself and for me. And I think she's just really surprised at me and who I've become, because I was a really painfully shy, socially anxious kid growing up. And so now to see me as a person who advocates and who speaks in front of large audiences, I think that's the biggest surprise for her.
That's
Not the drugs. Yeah.
how do you guys process, if at all, the fact that this is still illegal, considering that when you mentioned how the war on drugs has affected your family historically? What does it feel like right now? Was there a process to go through, or does it just feel different now?
I think it does feel different for her because she grew up in an era where surveillance was a real thing that people cared about. And now with my generation, people just straight up text you like, hey man, what's weed? And she's appalled when people do that. Even just talking on the phone, if someone mentions weed, she'll just hang up the phone because she's from that era where people would tap your phone. I remember, I forget, I think we were in Washington State. We went to a dispensary together, and that was such a big experience for her because she never thought the day would come where cannabis was legalized in anywhere in the US. And so walking into a store and being able to buy it and talk to someone about it, not having to hide it, is such a huge change from even the 90s. So I think that there's been more acceptance, like on the social side, civic side. My mom has always been very opinionated. I've known her to always be on a soapbox and very political growing up. And so she always talks about just how a lot of our laws in the US are counterproductive, inhumane, wasteful. So she's always talked about these kinds of things. And to, I guess, for it to actually be a reality is like affirming for us as a family because we were involved in it before it was trendy or cool.
Yeah, and in some ways, the battle is still disproportional, right, for people of color, right? So even if anybody can go and buy mushrooms, I think at least the perception or the fear of being incarcerated, of being screwed over by the state, perhaps
It's,
disproportionately affects people of color, which is a great segue to my last part of the interview, is around your work in People of Color
mhm.
Psychedelic Collective. Tell me a little bit about how
Mm.
that came to be. Why did you feel called to build this organization? And what is your mandate? What are you trying to get done?
I find that a lot of things in my life that come to fruition aren't necessarily things that I intentionally
Hmm.
put a certain thought into or a certain outcome. And the People of Color Psychedelic Collective started as an informal group on Zoom back in 2017. And this is after I worked at MAPS briefly in 2015, left after 8 months, but I still wanted to be involved in psychedelics. And so when I moved to New York in 2016, I was going to like events at the Alchemist Kitchen, I wrote a piece for Symposium, and I just found that mm, there wasn't anyone in the space really talking about race in a way that made sense. And after writing that piece, Why the Psychedelic Community is So White, I realized a lot of people were hitting me up and saying, oh, I read that piece. It resonated with me a lot. And so I got invited to this meeting via Zoom in 2017. And it was a whole bunch of people. There were even white folks there. And we were just talking about all the issues around lack of diversity and inclusion in the psychedelic field. At one point, someone said, "Oh, why don't we just give Nazis psychedelics?" And I'm like,
Oh
"Hold up,
boy.
why are we even talking about this? Can we not?" And so after that, after that initial call, I was like, I felt like I need to be the one to facilitate these calls going forward because I had experience facilitating workshops, and I want to continue to build this space up. And so we would have calls like once a month starting out. And some of our early projects, we got invited by the Philly Psychedelic Society, the Washington, D.C. Psychedelic Society to talk about patriarchy of psychedelics, how that shows up. And then we partnered with an organization called Cosmos and It's in Spanish, so I apologize for butchering it. But we fundraised $10,000 for the archive of Maria
Mm.
Sabina in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I think that's when we really start to see a need for this work. We had a lot of supporters who were like, "Hey, keep going." Even though we didn't have any money, we were volunteering. We're just doing this in our free time. In 2019 rolls around and we decide that we want to do a conference. We're sketching out this idea. One of my friends, Vincent Rado, I know a venue in DC that will host y'all. And I'm like, okay, skeptical. He brings me out to DC to check out the Eaton Hotel. And they were very welcoming, willing to work with us, gave us a venue for free. And so we're like, okay, now we have to do this conference. How are we going to do it? We had the idea, we have the venue. But so we ended up fundraising another $10,000 to put off this conference and advertise all the stuff, bringing speakers. It was really like we hit the ground running with it. And as we're planning it, we're like, no one's going to come to this conference. We didn't think, we're like, we're going to get like 20 people tops, y'all. And so it was scary just putting ourselves out there, not knowing what the outcome was
Mm.
going to be. But we ended up getting like a full house of people, like
Wow.
100 folks came out, and we had people from other parts of the country. I remember speaking to folks from Detroit, from Arizona. One woman took a bus up from North Carolina. And I was just like in awe of that because it just exceeded my expectations. And I just noticed that even after the conference was over, we're packing up the ring, people are still standing around talking. So it just reminded me how much this work is needed, how there was such a hunger for spaces like ours. And so that same year, we had a retreat in New Mexico, very small, but my friend Bet Williams let us use her house, and it was a really great retreat, 6 women. And I also spoke at the Women's Visionary Congress that year in Oakland, and I gave a talk on why intentional spaces for people of color are important. And so I started just as I stepped out and shared our message, people just naturally gravitated towards just wanting to support. And after that talk I gave in Oakland, this woman, Madeline McElwee, she's an attorney, came up to me and said, "Hey, I want to help you guys become a nonprofit." And so from 2019 up until 2023, Madeline worked with us pro bono to help us get our 501c3. Without the generous support of so many people in the space who believed in our work, believed in our mission, we wouldn't be here. So it was really grassroots. And I had no intentions for this project, or what started off as a project. But ultimately, our mission is really about educating people, because information can be a tool, asset, a weapon. And I believe that we've been misinformed about drugs and drug use here in the US. And so re-educating ourselves and our communities about drugs, the real risks associated with them without all the propaganda. Talk about why drugs are fun. People use drugs for fun, and that's okay. We live in a very pleasure averse society where people feel guilt for engaging with pleasure. And that's a big part of our work, educating people on the many different topics within psychedelics and the war on drugs, and creating spaces where people can build community with one another. Because I know for a lot of folks of color who are interested in psychedelics, they're always the token in their group. With the white kids, they don't feel like they have a group of their own people to talk about these things with. So that's what I want to show, is that we're not alone, even though it may feel that way. There's plenty of us doing these things who've been doing this work quietly way before I was even thought about. So
No, I love that. I also love your framing around we live in a very pleasure averse society, which is a strange thing to say in some way, because you're like everywhere people are eating too much, watching too many things on their phone all the time. But I think the kind of pleasure you're talking about, it's like an unmediated joy, right? Where it's, yeah, just joy of connecting, laughing, doing the things that human beings do. It's not like here, yeah, go be a foodie for whatever. That's the only thing you could do. And I just find that pleasure and joy in the society they live in today are very interesting ideas in a way, because people live too much in their heads, not enough in their body and in their hearts, right? As a closing question, Ifetayo, what would you recommend or advise people who are on the periphery, are hearing about psychedelics, happen to be people of color, have heard about it, are interested or curious, but scared or afraid or apprehensive at the same time? What would you say to them?
I would say that it's okay to be scared and apprehensive. That's okay. Don't try to fight that feeling so much. Just work through it if you want to work through it. Unpack why you're afraid, why you're hesitant. I think by confronting it head on, it's better, because if you don't and decide to take the substance anyway, then those fears are going to come back up during your journey. So it's good to do a lot of the work ahead of time before you even think about taking a substance. You know yourself and know where you stand on these things, because ultimately it's going to come out one way or the other. So I always suggest people to not only unpack those things, unpack the misconceptions you have around drugs, but also build a routine of care for yourself that involves other people. We talk about self-care, which is one facet of it, but also think about who's your support system. Who do you need to call when things get rough? And build that as like a regular practice. And it can look a lot of different ways. Calling your mom or your dad or your sister once a week or something like that. Doing yoga before you go to sleep at night. Doing meditation, especially if you have significant trauma. I always suggest building a self-care routine that touches on the mind, but also the body as well. Yeah, meditation, journaling, yoga, fitness. Building that routine will help you be able to handle whatever comes up. But it's just going to help you just have that foundation. Because if something scary does come up in the trip, you at least have a routine of taking care of yourself. And you know that there are some things that, hey, if things start to feel scary in this trip, maybe I can journal. Maybe I can turn on a meditation track, or maybe I can just run around and dance or something. Everyone doesn't have that luxury. Some people are so desperate where they just have to jump right in. And hey, that's okay too. I'm not knocking anyone's way of getting into it. But for folks who are hesitant, on the fence, educate yourselves. There's lots of resources out there. Hear about other people's journeys. Start small. You don't have to take 3.5 grams of mushrooms like I did my first
That's a
time.
lot.
I don't know if I would recommend that. I don't think I would recommend that to people. I started off with a lot, but you don't have to do that. You can start really small and start real comfortable and work your way up, and also have a plan to do some aftercare after it's over. What do you want to do to take care of yourself?
You
Yeah.
said I would heed that advice myself. If it's brilliant, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your story and the story of your family and the community. Well, is reflective of a lot of people, a lot of communities around the world. And so I think your work you're doing is inspiring, and I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome.
This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. If you're learning from or enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. It's a zero-cost way to support us and help us spread the word. Please also sign up with your email for new episode announcements, events, as well as our forthcoming newsletter. I'm your host, Rod Suraj. See you next time.